Good afternoon again. I'm Lally Weymouth from the Washington Post, and we have a very distinguished panel to hopefully inform you and entertain you, hopefully too. And at the end, I would like to introduce Ray Takia, who is, I would say, the leading scholar in the U.S. I don't want to get in trouble on Iran, but a leading scholar in the U.S. on Iran, and has, of course, many other distinguished attributes, but that's one of them. Then comes Bill Wexler, who was formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. It sounds like a terrifying title. Yes. But then comes my friend Zal Khalizadeh, who served as United States Ambassador to the UN, United States Ambassador to Iraq, and United States Ambassador to Afghanistan. All with distinction, of course. Then comes General Wald, who was former Deputy Commander of the U.S. European Command. No. Then comes Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, a career Foreign Service officer whom I've heard fantastic things about, who apparently ran a brilliant program out of the State Department to counter Al-Qaeda's propaganda. Am I right, General? Hello? Wake up. Anyway, hopefully. Then comes Hillel Fradkin, who is the director of the Hudson Institute's Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World. So he's, of course, a great authority on the topic of today. So we decided, anyway, we're going to start off today our fascinating, hopefully, discussion on, since 9/11, of course, the U.S. said we have two big enemies in the Middle East, one being terrorism and one being Iran. So I'm going to ask the panel to comment each, and hopefully not too briefly and interesting, please, on how do you see it, Ray, starting with you?
Brief and interesting.
Yeah.
I'll get the brief part right, hopefully. Well, Iran and terrorism are sort of co-joined.
Okay.
Because terrorism is a sort of a strategic doctrine of the Iranian state, the use of violence. And it's actually remarkably effective through the militias and various terrorist organizations that Iran has trained over the years that act as its proxy and progeny. And also, there was a time when terrorism was considered a weapon of the weak. In the hands of the Islamic Republic is a weapon of considerable strategic deterrence. Mm-hmm. Because right now, the Iranian case is that if the United States accuses us of terrorism, we will respond with terrorism against American forces in Iraq and elsewhere. That argument has been persuasive to a lot of people who essentially do not want to confront Iran for the fear of Iranian terrorism. Mm-hmm. So as a doctrine of statecraft, more so as a gesture of political violence, terrorism has been a remarkably effective tool for the Islamic Republic.
And you could say a little bit, the Iranians are backing the Houthis, right, in Yemen?
Well, they're involved in Syria, they're involved in Yemen, they're involved in Iraq, certainly Iraq, they're involved in Bahrain, they are involved throughout the region. And it's a sort of an imperialism on the cheap, because on the one hand, it is a very grand imperial project. On the other hand, by relying on proxies and surrogates, it's also cheaply executed, because at the end of the day, Islamic Republic does not have the treasury to sustain its own national armies. And also, Iran actually does suffer from its own version of the Vietnam syndrome. Since the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988, in aftermath of that war, is actually casualty averse. And it has no problems with Arab Shiites killing Arab Sunnis, but it kind of likes to maintain some measure of distance from that.
So they have no problem with members of Hezbollah dying in Syria, in other words?
None whatsoever.
And that's why they have members of Hezbollah, which obviously all of you know is right. The Shiite force from Lebanon.
Yeah, one of the most effective terrorist/militia groups in the Middle East history.
So, Bill?
So, as a result of all of that, Iran is getting closer every month to achieving its grander strategic objectives across the region. Not only to have control over Lebanon, but increasing control over Iraq and over Syria, to project power elsewhere and to disrupt disrupt Sunni governments throughout the region. At the same time, the other side of terrorism, besides the Iranian-sponsored terrorism, is of course the Salafi jihadist terrorism, most notably the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, which are on their heels right now. But as Secretary Panetta correctly said earlier today, they are not going away in any way, shape, or form. And the way that we have to continue to combat them is both through military means, and also through looking after the long-standing political challenges that aggravate Sunni interests in Iraq and elsewhere, but then also through what this panel is talking about, the sinews of terrorism, the finances and the ideology that still, in too many places, contribute to the growth of these Salafi jihadist groups.
So if you say that ISIS is not going away, do you see that if the Sunnis, for example, are not incorporated into life in Iraq, there will be a new ISIS junior group, or do you see them spreading into Africa, or where do you see ISIS going?
Sure. ISIS and son of ISIS, whatever its name should be, will expand because of the ideological, religious component of the view of a caliphate, and also local dynamics. And the local dynamics, as you said, in terms of Iraq, are about the Sunnis feeling excluded from the future of their country. Mm-hmm. And similar local dynamics work in other places where those types of organizations have achieved a lot of interest. And the real challenge for the United States, perhaps goes without saying, but I'll say it, is that those Salafi jihadist groups are unlike any of the other terrorist groups in that once they have a place that gives them sanctuary and they can act with impunity, they will do external attacks. We've seen it again and again. We saw it in Sudan, we saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Yemen, we saw it in Syria. And in every one of those instances, there were people in the United States government, people in the intelligence community that would say, this group is only interested in local issues. We see no evidence of them planning external attacks. Mm-hmm. And then we were always surprised that they went to external attacks. We need to understand that it's the nature of these kinds of groups to do this.
But right now, do you see any of these groups having a place to operate from?
There are local pockets where they still do have sanctuary.
But in
they still
countries?
operates. In all of these countries, in Syria, in Iraq, and then of course in Libya and in Yemen, Al-Qaeda and the Arab Peninsula is still one of those dangerous terrorist groups that we have.
Okay, Sal.
Well,
the two greatest threats being Iran and...
Sure.
Yeah.
On terrorism, I think one of the issues that we do not pay enough attention to is not only that there are groups that Iran supports, terrorist groups, directly, such as Hezbollah or Hamas, or some of these militias that now exist in Iraq, including one that is led by Abu Muhandis, who's responsible for the attack on our embassy in Kuwait many years ago.
Oh, nice.
But that Iran's policies create circumstances that lead at times to Sunni extremism and terror. Mm-hmm. And then Iran takes advantage of it. It's an arsonist on the one hand, but then it offers itself as a firefighter to come against those forces. For example, encouraging sectarianism in Iraq, or backing extreme measures taken by Bashar against the population, creates extreme circumstances. And in those extreme circumstances, Sunni extremists find a home. Mm-hmm. And then Iran comes as de facto a member of the coalition, although it's not a de jure member, and tries to defeat those forces. But it uses the defeat to extend its influence into those areas. Wow. For example, now you see in Iraq, in the Sunni areas of Iraq, which have been devastated because of the ISIS actions and the actions taken against ISIS, but now there are Sunni militias, these popular mobilization forces, we assume they are all Shia. They're not. There are some that are now Sunni militias working with Iran to control those areas. So we are very good at going after the terrorists, which we should, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But we're not that good at what we do afterwards, so this threat doesn't reemerge politically. How do you organize the area in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of self-government, in terms of participation and power sharing? But Iran is very cleverly uses counterterrorism to extend its control. And at the moment, because they have made great progress in the Sunni Iraq area and in Syria, the crisis between the Kurds in Iraq and the Baghdad government has created an opportunity for them to bring Kurdistan to heel. General Soleimani, the head of the Quds force, has been the architect of the fight between the Iraqis and the Kurds. And the militia forces that they control have been heavily involved in the fight against the Kurds. And in fact, last night there was a meeting between the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces. The Iraqi delegation was 3/4 made up of forces that Iran controlled or Iran itself. There was not only the Iraqi military represented, but also the militia forces were there that Iran controls. There was an Hezbollah from Lebanon representative in the meeting, and also an Iranian, presumably from the Quds force. Iran has made great progress in influencing Iraq generally, but there was a pocket where the Kurds, particularly the KDP Kurds, the Barzani Kurds, who were more independent of Iran, and they want to bring them to heel. And it's very important that in the aftermath of what the president has announced, our new Iran strategy, the Iranians are pushing forward, not being restrained, not being deterred, but that they are being more aggressive. And it's very important that, in my view, that we look at these militia forces that are in Iraq. Some of them now have acquired American weapons, and I don't know whether anybody from the Pentagon or Congress are still here. It's very important that we demand that those American equipment, such as Abrams tanks, are not allowed to be controlled or owned by the militia forces. They either need to be returned to the Iraqi regular forces, or we need to disable them.
But they're also with the Peshmerga too, right?
Well, the Peshmerga have some equipment, less capable equipment than the Iraqi forces, the regular Iraqi forces, and some of the equipment that the militias have acquired from the Iraqi forces, either because of the abandonment of those weapons by the forces in the face of ISIS or by the current government. This is an important issue. We don't want another Hezbollah in Iraq, these militias, which that's what Iran wants, to create an Hezbollah that they can do burden sharing when they run into difficulties, use these people as they have been doing with Hezbollah in Syria, and sending also Iraqi militias to Syria, and even bringing Afghans, Shiites, and Pakistani Shiites to minimize their role in terms of what Ray was mentioning, their Vietnam, because it's expensive. So how do you reduce the cost, get others to do your dirty work? And that's what they have been doing. So I think I agree with the notion that the terrorism and Iran, in part they are separate from each other, but in part they are part of the same problem. And I believe that for the longer term, while Iran wants to dominate the region and throw us out of the the Middle East. It sees itself as a rising hegemon, and the logic of a rising hegemon is usually doesn't want balancers around, and the U.S. is the balancer that focusing to make Iran a normal state is an abnormal state. I have to say it's in part a state. It has structures of a state, but in part is a revolution that seeks to spread and be promoted and use that to dominate the region. And by defeating Iran's effort at hegemony, I think we would, should we succeed in that, and it won't be easy, then we can also make progress to make Iran a normal state. And I believe that a serious containment strategy is needed.
So considering what you just said, do you feel that the U.S. is playing an active enough role in Iran? I'm sorry, in Iraq, helping to contain Iran and helping to say to Abadi, for instance, the prime minister of Iraq, don't coordinate with the Iranian forces and help the Peshmerga and don't fight with them? Or how do you see the administration's actions?
I think that we're a little unhappy with the Kurds, with President Barzani, because he didn't listen to us when we asked him not to hold a referendum, and we made an alternative offer. But I think we ought to think larger, more broadly than just being unhappy with this kind of non-binding referendum. Shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that 93% of Kurds want to have a country of their own. I mean, this was a more or less a public opinion.
What's with the other 7%? What's with the other 7%?
Why did they say? What did they think? But I think because of that disappointment, I think we have not been strong enough and engaged enough since these hostilities began. I think we need to make it very clear, loud and clear, that all use of force must stop, that negotiation must begin immediately. And how is it that the Iranians are sitting at the table in the negotiations between Iraq and the Kurds?
This is amazing.
And that where are we, so to speak, on this? So
we're missing?
I would think we need to be given, especially in the light of the president's strategy, I would have thought we would be more active in pushing back rather than watching as the Iranians expand their influence into yet another zone that was outside at least the part of Kurdistan that Barzani runs into that zone. I think they would like to bring the Barzanis to a situation, the KRG, that they would look to Iran rather than looking to the West or to the United States or have relations with Israel. Those are, I think, the Iranian objectives. It's quite clear, and they've been very effective, very clever in pursuing their objectives. One has to say that. But it is in part that, but in part also that we have, and as Secretary Panetta said, we haven't put a coalition together for an effective pushback strategy, for really extending Iranian entanglement in a protracted conflict so that they are disciplined over time by being overextended, as we did with the Soviets in various theaters. I think we need to relearn those lessons.
So, General, of course, you have so much experience, and you've thought about the Middle East a lot. I wonder how you see the issue of Iran and of terrorism.
Yeah.
And what you think about what's out
Well,
there.
I think what the previous speakers mostly is I agree with, but I would say that my sense is a couple of big things. One is I think, I've said this before several years ago in your paper, we're in this probably for the rest of our life, I think. People say generational. I'd say, depends on how old you are, just some of us that have been there. But we're going to be doing this the rest of us. So this is not like ISIS goes away, let's stop and take a breath and start over. This is beginning. Two is, I don't think the status quo in the Middle East, this is Wald speaking, will ever be the same again. And I think people...
Because?
I just don't think it fits. I mean, I look at countries like my favorite, the Arab Emirates, or Saudi Arabia, or Israel actually having a common interest, which is really hard to say publicly. It's not been very well received a lot of times. I think those common interests are starting to build. So I think the status quo in the Middle East will never go back to the way it was. I go back to what Pastor Khalilzad just talked about with the Kurds. I mean, the Kurds, to me, it's hard to argue with what they've done. They have actually shown responsibility and defended their territory. And again, that's going to be tough because we want Mahdi to be, everybody's kind of yearning for going back to a united Iraq the way it used to be, and everybody kind of makes nice. And I have a tough time thinking that's ever going to happen. So I think, and again, you'll have people like Secretary Mattis or Secretary Tillerson or others say, Wald, maybe you ought to stick in your own lane. I get it. But I would think, and I know they're thinking about this, but we have not articulated a common view of what the end state may be sometime. And I think people have this tendency to want to yearn for the melancholy the way it used to be and kind of go back to the status quo. And even though there's tension there, but it's kind of tension by virtue of presence, and we do a few missions over Iraq for no-fly zones, et cetera. I don't think that's going to happen again. I think this growing threat in Africa, we worked on this back in 2001 when we started talking about it, and people said, you're just kind of, a typical military guy, you're trying to throw kerosene on a fire. But it's happening. And so we need a broad, it's going to be very difficult.
You're talking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS
exactly.
extending into
The whole
Africa.
issue about, it's connected, there's no doubt about it. And so long term, we're going to have to, I think, look at what maybe the Middle East likely could look like realistically. I think we need to box in Assad, literally. We need to box him in.
Get rid of him, you mean?
Box him in. He'll get rid of himself eventually. You can't get things in there.
So
and there's
give
a way
him
to do
a
that.
small piece of land or what?
Let him sit there for a while. I think we need to counter the Iranians sending arms to Syria, let's say, or to terrorists, or to the Houthis in Yemen. They need to be countered. And I think we need to commit the United States to a long time in the Middle East in a big way, and we need to work with our friends from the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and others to say this, and Egypt for that matter. This is what probably is a doable end state that we're probably going to have to see the end in maybe 20 years, 30 years from now, but we'll start now.
That's very interesting. Ambassador.
Well, I think when we look at Iran and terrorism, I think when we make that phrase, we're starting off making a mistake, because the Iranian...
We were saying they're two big issues.
No, what I'm saying is that we all too often focus on Iran, the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism, and fail to see the much broader ambition and action that Iran is doing on the ground. Terrorism is one part of it. One of the challenges I think we face is that we, meaning especially the United States, are misaligned in this challenge. Iran is tactically flexible, but has a strategic vision. Think of it. Iran works with Sunni extremists. It works with Al-Qaeda. And yet it fights then Sunni extremists, Salafi jihadists in other places. There's even a Iranian militia, Iranian-supported militia that's made up of at least the leadership in Iraq of Iraqi Christians. So they have tremendous flexibility in the tools they use. Terrorism is only one of them. War is another one. Political issues, kind of political subversion is another one. So this Iranian ground game, which is occurring, is one which we have traditionally been misaligned and not ready to challenge. So we talk about things like interdicting weapons or stopping terrorism. That's a small part of what they're doing. Part of what they're doing is guys, threatening people, guys giving people bags of money, all kinds of way that they are advancing a political agenda in the region. And we're all too often seeing the challenge in a one-dimensional way and thinking of nation states. And obviously, our relationship with our friends in the region is paramount. But that's only a small part of what the Iranian offensive looks like. So when we reduce it to just terrorism, when we reduce it actually to kind of violence on the ground, we're missing this whole other panoply of hybrid war, of political action, of subversion, of bribery, of corruption, all of which is part of a much broader agenda. We need to get our own ground game in order if we seek to challenge them, rather than kind of picking them from afar, kind of, looking at things like, FTO designation of the IRGC or money. Those are just small elements of what is a much broader array of Iranian tools that they are using.
I don't think that's evaded the eyes of our allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab, and Egypt, for example, President Sisi. I think they're well aware of the Iranian role in the Middle East, don't you?
I think they are, but I think part of the problem is that they have been consistent in what they've doing, what they've been doing. I mean, we are starting from behind. Until a few months ago, we had an administration that talked about sharing the Middle East and equilibrium in the Middle East, which of course would mean a percentage gain by Iran in the region, and indeed that's what we're seeing.
So how do you feel about the Trump administration's policies?
Well, I think they've said the right thing. I think that I was at a panel at the Hudson Institute just a week and a half ago on this. They've said the right thing. The focus is the right focus. The question is that ground game. The question is that type of granularity and detail on the ground that you need to do to challenge them. Not just by passing some laws or talking about money coming in. That's just a small part of the thing.
But can you really have a ground game if half the State Department is empty, for example?
Well, that's a very good question. That is part of your ground game. The work of development, the work of politics, the work of relationship, the work of the intelligence community, all of that has to be part of our response to what they're doing.
Just real quick, first of all, I think he's right, but I would not trivialize Quds forces or other things. They aren't the small part. There's a whole bunch of big parts, and so that they're not just going to go away on their own. Anyway, I know you didn't say that, but
Well,
Last but not least.
there's been a great deal said that's very much true, very much needed to be said, and I won't go over the same ground, but I wanted to pick up on two things that follow from the earlier discussion. One is this flexibility of the Iranians that was referred to by Ray, by Alberto, Zal, and so forth, and Will. At one level, it looks like just simply Machiavellian, a complete unscrupulousness. And it has, that's a lot of it. But one also, I think it's worth noting that there's a kind of way in which for example, the use of Sunnis or the attempt to have alliances with Sunnis goes back deep to the foundations of the regime and to the perspective of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was an admirer of his predecessors on the Sunni side in the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, partially because they laid out an object, the foundation of a new Islamic state that would be redemptive of Muslim history. And that went so far as to being translating works from Arabic into Persian, in particular the works of Sayyid Qutb, who came to be the leading intellectual figure. And it's worth noting that his Persian translator was the present supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. So there's a kind of, from the Iranian point of view, it doesn't only need to be Machiavellian, and from that point of view, from the Sunni side, it doesn't also have to be simply Machiavellian or cynical. There is a way in which at least certain parts of the Sunni radical movement and the Shiite radical movement can see themselves as working together for the greater good. And one of the places where that, and that's a remarkable thing, one of the places where that oddly has come to meet and join in this little country, Qatar, which is the host of the Muslim Brotherhood, has played has maintained warm relations with Iran.
You're thinking of Qatar.
With Qatar,
Yeah.
Qatar. That this peculiar, more friendly relationship of Sunni radicalism and Shiite radicalism has a home in some respects. And that's not important for the dynamics in the region. The last thing I want to say is that about our policies and so forth. I think it was said earlier by Secretary Panetta that trust in one's word matters a lot. And when you've lost it, it's very hard to get it back with words. We've had quite a lot of words and very little American action. And the most recent thing was went in the same direction. The president announced a new policy on Iran, in which the IRG was the most notable object. And about 48 hours later, the IRGC took Kirkuk from our allies. So I think, unless maybe that was all that could be done, but for the future, the only way in which the region is going to have some confidence in us is if we do something hard, clear, and tough. That's
Right. Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Ambassador?
Yeah, we need to learn to play the long game as well as the 4-year cycle.
But do you agree with Hillel that we should have somehow stopped them from taking Kirkuk?
I think we needed to know clearly, and you have to remember that the PMUs, the Iranian-supported ones, were moving north even before the president's announcement. So anyone with any kind of following of events on Iraq could see that something was going to happen. At the very least, we needed to be in a position to say, these are our red lines.
Right.
These are our parameters. And it's not clear that we did that. Or if we did that, it doesn't seem to have been fulfilled.
They walked right over. Okay, you have something to say,
On this?
Ambassador?
Well, I think it's very important that with any big declaration, and we've had a good declaration on Iran, that there is an action plan, a strategy.
By President Trump, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. That we have an action plan, a strategy, and timelines, that the rest of the bureaucracy gets appropriately organized and staffed
And that's not happening?
resourced, and people are held accountable for producing results. And I think conceptualizing the problem, we've done that well. But actually implementing the strategy, developing a detailed strategy and implementing it is where I think more attention needs to be paid.
So politely speaking, it hasn't been done.
I think as we see in the case of Iraq, Kirkuk, and that certainly one can point to shortcomings.
And you agree?
Yeah, I do.
You agree?
We take,
So there's been a policy
if we wind up with a result of 93%, will that be
Good, really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to Syria now. Okay, so Raqqa fell last week, which was obviously a fantastic development. The Trump administration's policy, from what I can see, is to leave President Assad in power. How do you feel about that? Do you think it's a good policy?
I don't think there is an option at this particular point, because in a sort of a civil war condition, in a broken condition that Syria is, the dirty little secret is that the only way Syria, in my view, others can comment on that more informatively than I can be stabilized is for an outside auxiliary force to come in and impose a peace, like happened in Lebanon when Syrian forces went in and imposed peace. And that's the way you can impose a kind of a demarcation model. In absence of that, and I don't see evidence of that, I think Syria will remain this mess that it is as we see it today.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the window of opportunity to have dealt with Assad closed long ago. And the scenarios that we're looking at now, in the absence of an external actor coming in a way that I think is highly unlikely, are either the regime supported by Iran and Russia slowly continuing to progress across the country, or quickly doing so. Unfortunately, I think that's where we are. And then amongst the questions for U.S. interests are, in the aftermath, Iran is going to have a lot more placement and access in the south to be able to cause problems for allies of ours like Jordan and Israel. And so how do we confront them and deny them the ability over the long run to take advantage of that placement?
That's a very good point.
I think it's very important strategically, if we are serious about containing Iran, is to make sure that Iran doesn't have a contiguous land access from Iran across Iraq, across Syria, Lebanon to the Mediterranean. And our Syria strategy should be informed by that objective, which means we should, as Secretary Panetta said, and I agree with him, we need to maintain a presence in Syria. And we need to develop a strategy for increasing the costs for Iran on the ground, which the ground force is mostly Iran or Iranian-backed elements. That ground force has great vulnerabilities. We can increase the cost of maintaining or expanding
The Hezbollah force?
the Hezbollah force, or controlling more of the areas of Syria. To
From
block the ground access that I mentioned on the one hand, but two, that although immediately a settlement to get rid of Bashar is not in the cards, I agree with my colleague, but over time as cost goes up, because there are a lot of Syrians who are not happy with keeping Bashar there. They may, both the Iranians and the Russians and some Syrians may recalibrate. I think the cost for us would be much lower than the cost for them, for the other side. So, and we need to exploit that asymmetry in relative burden.
And you also believe that we should leave troops in Iraq, too?
I believe very strongly that we need to maintain a military presence. I think President Obama made a mistake to get all our forces out. And if we get our forces out, it's either Iran will even become more dominant and entrenched, and the possibility that when I was ambassador in Iraq, we got rid of Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Yeah.
And, our military forces. We killed the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Zarqawi. But when we left, the vacuum that was created, as again Secretary Panetta said, Maliki became more sectarian, independent of our pressure and presence, and oppressed the Sunnis. And with the disintegration of Syria, you got ISIS emerging. And I believe that it's possible that you get a new version of extremism and terrorism group emerging should we abandon Iraq again, and if we don't play it right in Syria.
Yeah, I would go with that. I would say my view would be, if you want to kind of a comment about what it should be, I'd say keep Assad in Syria, keep the Iranians out, tell Assad you're going to have to live there the way it is, and you're not going to have a very good life because there's hardly anything coming in. Number two is you drop another barrel bomb out of Syria with one of your airplanes, it's the last time you're going to have an Air Force. You're done. And we should never let that happen in the first place. We should have taken his total Air Force out. We could have done it. It would have been very easy. And so we ought to just say, hey, Assad, congratulations. You have it's kind of a comfortable prison you're going to be in the rest of your life. Iranians, stay out. You're not going to be part of that. And Russia, by the way, if you start flying bombing missions against our troops, that's the end of it, period. And so I think we need to quit mamby-pambying around and just say this is where it's going to be and live with it. If we have to do this for years after come, fine.
But wait, the Iranians, you're saying, but the Iranians
Keep 'em
are
out.
in Syria.
I'd keep them from supplying. I'd keep them from taking the.
You mean the way the
they're
Israelis
talking
are
about
doing?
Yeah, exactly. I wish they
every
would
ti-
have.
every time
They do it, I'd go after them.
You mean
And the
every-
Israelis do it exactly right, as far as I'm concerned. When's the last time anybody went after Israel for taking out an S-400 system going into Syria. Never. I'd do it.
But I thought their red line was they don't want transfer of weapons from Syria to Lebanon.
Yeah, that's part of it. They don't want them in Syria either.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, my point is, what's the difference? Lebanon, Syria, I don't want them in there, period. I don't want to be threatened.
So you don't want the weapons coming from Iran?
Either the Mediterranean, from Iraq, Turkey.
So maybe we should nominate you.
Well,
Yeah.
I won't serve, but I'm telling you what, we didn't do something.
And so you're not very happy with the policy, I take it.
Well, no, listen, I'm not trying to, criticize. First of all, I wouldn't criticize Mattis for anything. But I think it's difficult for somebody like him or even Tillerson maybe to articulate what I just said. I think we should do that. There may be a lot better way to say it. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we've publicly said anything like that. And I'm not sure even privately we have a consensus on the policy. I think we'll know it when we see it, and we'll, I hate to say it, but, ISIS, they've done a good job on ISIS, whack-a-mole, but, ISIS is just a manifestation of a broader, as we all know. ISIS just happens to be one of the farm teams for the pros. I mean, anyway, yeah, that's what I'd do.
Well, as I said, I think our audience would put you in charge. So, Ambassador?
Well, I think one of the challenges, of course, we face is we're dealing with the legacy issue of a deeply immoral, cynical policy by the previous administration regarding Syria, which basically brought about a nuclear agreement floating on a sea of Syrian blood. So we're limited. We have a difficult challenge in the hand that we've been dealt now. But Ambassador Khalilzad talked about the land bridge to the Mediterranean. That is going to be decided in the next few days as somebody drives towards Abu Kamal on the Syrian-Iraqi border. Absolutely. And if it's the Syrian army, then they will have a land bridge. Wow. We have a problem. Yeah. A challenge
explain.
We have a challenge and a problem. The Iranians, of course, have not only forces in Syria, but they have many proxies, including the Syrian regime.
Exactly.
Who are our proxies in the region? Right. We have, in Syria, we have a proxy which is powerful, important, and deeply problematic, which is the SDF/YPG, etc. Which is militarily significant and militarily important, and has all kinds of political and ethnic question marks there.
We're talking about the Syrian Kurds.
The Syrian Kurds. So the question is our relationship with the Syrian Kurds. If we're going to, we need to either, put up or shut up. If they are unclean, deeply unclean, because they hold up pictures of the terrorist Apple, then fine. Then we're going to act a certain way. But if not, we need to find a way to use them as proxies. We need to make them less Kurdish, more accepting of Arabs, less like the PKK. More of a useful tool for us, especially if we want to, in a very immediate way, we want to block Iranian ambitions in the next few weeks and months.
Absolutely.
Wow. Hello?
I will just endorse what was just said because I understand our time is out. The only is up. The only thing I want to say is this: with regard to Syria, I think General Wald has the right perspective on it. What I fear is that we're going to be between two other alternatives. One is a kind of slow management of the situation. Assad won't control things, but neither will we. There will be nothing resolved, which will create the conditions for some major miscalculation arising from where. And the thing I hope we are thinking about: what happens if the Iranians launch some kind of initiative against Jordan, against Israel, and so forth? Where are we going to be then?
That's got to be there to protect them.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I hope that you found this interesting. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I thought you were terrific. We could go on a lot longer, but I'm getting signs from the front row that we're supposed to stop. So thank you, audience. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.